For many Catholics, it feels like the traditional Latin Mass is disappearing. Parishes have closed their Latin Mass communities. Restrictions continue to grow, and many faithful Catholics now believe the ancient liturgy has been completely banned. But according to some canon lawyers and traditional Catholic groups, the situation may not be that simple. They argue that the Church's own legal system still contains protections for Catholics attached to the traditional Latin Mass, often called the TLM. And that debate has become even more intense in 2026. Earlier this year, Cardinal Arthur Roche reaffirmed support for Traditionis Custodes, the Vatican document that placed major restrictions on the Latin Mass. The Reformed liturgy was described as the sole expression of the Roman rite. At the same time, Archbishop Carlos Alberto Breis Pereira in Maceió issued a decree warning that attending unauthorized Latin Masses could be treated as a public act of schism. For many Catholics attached to the old rite, these announcements created fear and confusion. But critics of the restrictions argue something important often gets ignored. They say headlines, Vatican statements, and local decrees are not always the same thing as binding church law. According to them, the 1983 Code of Canon Law still contains principles that may protect Catholics seeking the traditional Latin Mass. One of the biggest arguments centers around what is called a state of necessity. Supporters point to Canon 1323. This canon says a person may avoid penalties if they act out of necessity to prevent serious harm, as long as the act itself is not evil. Traditional Catholics argue that when the ancient liturgy is removed completely, some believers experience serious spiritual harm. They believe the old Mass is deeply connected to their faith, prayer life, and spiritual identity. Because of that, they argue Catholics may still seek the sacraments even when restrictions exist. Supporters often point to situations like the one in Charlotte, where Bishop Michael Martin moved the traditional Latin Mass community out of parish churches and into a former Protestant building. For many traditional Catholics, that became a symbol of the growing conflict inside the church. Another important argument involves something called supplied jurisdiction. This idea comes from Canon 144. In simple terms, it means the church can supply authority in situations where confusion, doubt, or spiritual need exists. Supporters claim this allows priests to continue offering sacraments to the faithful, even during legal disputes about permissions and restrictions. They also make an important distinction between a Mass being illicit and invalid. An illicit Mass may violate church rules or permissions, but supporters argue it can still remain spiritually valid and sacramentally real. Then, there's the argument about tradition itself. Canon 27 says custom is one of the best ways to interpret church law. Traditional Catholics believe the Latin Mass is not a modern invention, but an ancient custom developed over centuries. Some also point to Canon 5, which discusses long-standing customs that may continue even when newer laws appear to conflict with them. Because of this, many traditional Catholics argue that a recent decree cannot simply erase a liturgical tradition that shaped the Church for hundreds of years. Still, most church leaders reject these interpretations. The Vatican maintains that bishops have authority to regulate the liturgy in their diocese. Supporters of the restrictions argue the goal is unity within the Church, not persecution. But for Catholics attached to the traditional Latin Mass, the issue feels deeply personal. Many say this is not about rebellion. It is about preserving a form of worship they believe carries beauty, reverence, and spiritual depth. For now, the debate continues. And for many Catholics around the world, the future of the traditional Latin Mass remains one of the biggest and most emotional battles inside the modern Church.